Judy Olian is the 8th Dean of the UCLA Anderson School of Management. She began her appointment on January 1st, 2006, after serving 5.5 years as Dean and Professor of Management at the Smeal College of Business Administration at Penn State. Under her leadership, the Anderson School is executing a comprehensive strategic plan to expand the school's global presence. During her first year and a half at Anderson, the school celebrated the launch of the Center for Finance and Investments, the newest of the school's 7 research centers. Her global perspective was highlighted today, actually, in an article in the New York Times, which discussed a fantastic new exchange program that places aspiring entrepreneurs in places like China and India for firsthand experience. Chicago real estate billionaire Sam Zell has been in the news a lot lately, too, following his successful acquisition of the Tribune Company, which is the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. The chairman of the private investment firm, Equity Group Investments, Zell has nicknamed himself the Grave Dancer for his reputation for buying distressed assets at a discount and turning them around. Zell's daring entrepreneurial spirit, which took shape in the 60s real estate market, now extends to transportation, high finance, energy, media, communications, and real estate. Something I should also mention is that Sam and his wife Helen lived part of the year in a beautiful home in Malibu that was designed by John Lautner. And we know about this and care about this because the Hammer is hosting a major retrospective of Lautner's work this coming summer. So we appreciate that they're taking care of this place. Please join me in welcoming Judy Olian and Sam Zell.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to first apologize if you hear me coughing and wheezing. It's basically to give Sam even more time to talk, and we'll all appreciate that. And if you probably imagine that I'm going to be a bit of a fly on the wall here and prompt Sam to talk about his life, his thinking, his views on the economy, on media, and on how he thinks differently. So I'm going to start with the beginning, in a sense. Sam starts out his life as a son of immigrant parents. Actually, it's a bit of a similar story to mine, who escaped the Holocaust in a rather remarkable way. And his father was pretty remarkable. So, Sam, if you don't mind, tell us what you learned to be or not to be from your dad.
Well, I think that the best way to describe my father was that we had a party for his 80th birthday. And I got up and I toasted him. And I said, the most complimentary thing I can tell you, Dad, is that you're 80 years old and still a worthy adversary. And he was just a very extraordinary, very smart man, and someone who certainly, made major contributions to my thinking and the way I looked at the world.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about the fact that they were immigrants through the skin of their teeth arriving in the United States and what that did to the family?
They basically lived in an area of Poland called Silesia. And they left on August 31st, 1939, and the Luftwaffe bombed the rail yards at 6 a.m. And at that point, the only way they could escape was to go east. So they ended up going all the way across Poland, Lithuania, Russia, to Vladivostok, then to Japan, and then they arrived in the United States in May of 1941. And, it was one of those scenarios where my father was convinced that this was the right thing to do. He tried to convince other members of the family to go with him. None of them would go, and all but 2 ended up, dying in the Holocaust.
And you said, I've heard you say, that he was right then and he was never wrong again.
Well, that's for sure. That's why our relationship was so unique in that I basically spent most of my time apologizing for things he did to me.
Okay. Now, I think one of the recurring themes this evening is going to be that you're different. You think differently. You do act differently in very interesting and admirable ways. But one of the things I've heard said about you, or you even said about yourself, was that you were, excuse me, different as a kid, born old. Tell us about that.
Well, that particular comment came from about a year after I got out of law school. My parents lived in the suburbs, and I was going to their house for dinner. And I happened to sit on the train with a friend of my father's, and I made a comment about the fact that I had just hired a young lawyer to work for me. And I said, and then I said, well, young, that's silly. He's like 6 months younger than I am. And this guy looked at me and said, yeah, Sam, but you were born old. What that means, at least from my description, is that I just, I completely believe that this, as much as anything, I was born 90 days after my parents came to this country. So I really was brought up in a very, very, clear immigrant environment, an environment where my parents instilled in me how wonderful this country was, and what a unique and special experience it was that they could actually come here, and the streets are paved with gold and opportunity. And I grew up in a very different environment than my peers. And I thought it was very unfair at the time. I mean, I used to want to go out every night, and every Friday and Saturday night. And my father would, his attitude was, "You have too much fun already. Stay home, read, study." You
You've
can
made up,
imagine how popular that was with me.
but you've made up for that, I think, in later years.
I'm doing my best.
Yeah. Now, your first business, and this is where I think maybe being old as a kid, your first business was when you were in school at Michigan, or maybe earlier.
Oh, I had earlier businesses.
Okay.
Actually, the first business I had was that when I was 13, or actually 12, my parents moved from the city to the suburbs. And then, because I had started going to Hebrew school when I was 5, by the time I was 12, there really wasn't any adequate school available in the suburbs at that time. So every day after school, I would ride on the train back into the city and go to a heavy-duty educational Hebrew school called the yeshiva. And of course, you're 12 years old and you're very curious, and I'm still very curious at 66. And one of the things that I discovered was that there were these magazine stands underneath the L stations that sold stuff that they didn't sell in the suburbs. And in 1953, they came out with this new magazine called Playboy. And I looked at it, and I came up.
This might be interesting.
Yeah, so I thought it was really good. So I would buy the magazine for 50 cents. I'd read it on the train on the way home, and then I'd sell it to my friends for $3.
Now, does that deal sound familiar? Yeah, in terms of a trend. But you also had some deals, some housing.
Well, when I was an undergraduate in Ann Arbor, I had a very close friend who lived in a house, and in a single-family house, and the owner of the house had bought the house next door, and he was going to rip it down and build an apartment building. And I just said to my friend, "Why don't we pitch him? We'll manage it. We're students. We understand." And so we did, and they bought our act. And so we ran this building, and we did good enough. They gave us another building, and then other people came to us. So by the time I graduated from law school, I think we were managing about 5,000 apartments But for anybody in the room who's ever been to law school, I've never had a more boring experience in my life. So I had enormous motivation to do other things.
So, so from early on, you had a lot of chutzpah and self-confidence in
Yeah, I can't even explain to you why, other than I always viewed myself differently. I marched to a different tune. I had just, and still to this day, have, just enormous self confidence. Maybe not justified, but sometimes it doesn't matter because if you believe, that's all that counts. But that's always been, part of my characteristics when I teach entrepreneurship. I talk about, how true entrepreneurs ultimately have this innate self-confidence. I mean, they never fail. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but they never fail. Uh, and they can get up off the floor, whether it's Sam Walton or Fred Smith at FedEx or any others. They have just an unequivocal belief in their ability to solve problems.
So where has it not worked out? Notice I didn't say failed. Where has it not worked out?
Well, I mean, the answer is it's like the banker that never has a loss. Uh, I wouldn't want that banker working for me because he doesn't take risk. Um, there have been numerous transactions over the years that haven't worked out. We bought Carter Hawley Hale stores here in Los Angeles. Um, in the 3 years we owned it, we had race riots, floods, fires, earthquake. Um, and in the end, we sold it. We lost some money. The name of the game is not where it did it or did it not work out. The name of the game is, can you calibrate the risk? Can you identify the risk so that you know before you start what your exposure is? And so, for example, when we bought Carter Hawley Hale, at the time it was in bankruptcy. I sent my guys out and we looked at, they had 79 stores. We looked at every store and my instructions were, I wanted fire sale on paper, the whole company. And we did that. And I said, okay, what's the number? And the number that it came out to be was about 80% of what we were paying. So that meant that our gamble was 20% would work. Well, we had all these terrible things happen to us. We also were not very good retailers. And in the end, we sold it for exactly the number that we originally said was, in effect, the bottom.
So it didn't shake your self-confidence.
No.
Did you learn something from it?
Oh, sure. Stay out of retail.
Okay, so just shifting direction a little, and I promise you I'm going to open it up for questions in a little bit, but I'm going to go through Sam's life a little before that. You're going global. You are now really a globally distributed real estate enterprise. Where and why?
Well, 12 years ago, first of all, I have always been someone who truly believes that you have to see everything. And so, for example, I spend 1,200 hours a year on my plane.
Now, did you catch that? That's more than half of one's work life.
Yeah.
That-
It's about average 3 hours a day, 365 days a year. And the reasoning is very simple. I believe that
don't like being in one place.
that's true. But I really believe in seeing what's going on, observing what's going on. I think that there are patterns that evolve, and you have to recognize them and understand them. So, some 12 years ago, we started what we call Equity International, which is our international real estate platform. And we did it, which is maybe a trademark, but we did it, completely differently than anybody else. In other words, to the extent that other people invested in real estate outside of the United States, they bought buildings, individual buildings, they bought groups of buildings. We concluded that what we really needed to do was identify real estate related platforms, and that we needed to be able to equitize them in the local markets as well as the New York Stock Exchange. And so we have, over the last 12 years, built a very large international business. We're probably the largest low-income housing builder in the world, through a whole series of different companies that we control. It started in Mexico with a company called Homex. Homex is still today the largest home building company in Mexico. Last year we delivered 58,000 units, mortgaged them, sold them, built them, and delivered them. We have a similar, actually a bigger operation now in Brazil. We're building low-cost housing in Egypt, China, in 2 different locations. So, and in various cases, we took Homex public on the New York Stock Exchange. We took the FISA, which is our Brazilian company, public on the Brazilian Stock Exchange, and then took it public on the New York Stock Exchange. And we just recently took our first Chinese company public. But they're all, focused on serving the lower to middle class in emerging markets. And we've done almost nothing in Europe, nothing in Japan. We don't understand the risk-reward ratio of the developed world.
So I'm sure I'm asking the question on everyone's mind. How the heck do you manage that enterprise and serve as CEO of Tribune?
Well, those aren't the only 2 things I'm responsible for. The answer is, I'm the chairman of the board of 5 or 6 New York Stock Exchange companies. We have a vast private empire that we manage. I think in the most simple answer, with the exception of the Tribune, I'm the chairman of everything and the CEO of nothing. In the Tribune's case, I took the CEO's position specifically because I realized that the only way the Tribune would work is if I could create very significant change. In an organization that's ossified and bureaucratic, the natural question would always be, what does Sam think? Do this. What does Sam think? Well, the answer is, Sam's the CEO. As I sent an email to my 19,000 employees 2 weeks ago, there seems to be a lot of discussion in this company about who's in charge. I'm in charge, and that's my job. And so, at least for the near term, I'm playing the role of CEO, and I'm very busy.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on that stream in a minute, but I want you to turn to these glorious pieces of sculpture here. And there are 675 lucky people who every year get a gift from Sam, which includes his holiday message. And we're going to show you one of them, if you don't mind cueing the first one. And this was done in 1999. In addition to being quite a folly, it's telling about Sam's thinking. So before we go to that clip, can you just tell us how much time do you spend the whole year developing each of these and the songs that go with them?
Generally, every year, usually in May or June, I take a motorcycle trip somewhere in the world.
Zell's Angels.
Zell's Angels.
So,
And that's usually, the week that I spend, in my helmet. And so by myself. And inevitably, that's the period when I start thinking about what I'm going to do for the year-end gift. The origins of this are that in 1976, my business got to the point where I got a lot of pens and pencils and calendars and chocolate and oranges and various other things of that nature. And the idea or the concept that I was going to send somebody a calendar with my name on it or something like that. So instead, my idea was that I would just send everybody where my head was every year. And of course, like anything, if the first one was a simple lucite block, and the last ones are overly complicated. But usually I start in May. I come up with the idea and where my head is at and what I want to cover. And then I start thinking about how I'm going to translate it, and both in terms of creating the image and identifying a song that I think, delivers the message.
So can we cue the first one? It's called The Emperor Has No Clothes, and it's the 1999.
Yeah, I sent this out in December of 1999.
Remember, that was the heyday of the dot-com boom. Everything was going swimmingly. So here we go. I hope you can see all right.
This is Sam Zell. This musical fable does not question the new technology. It just questions its valuation. Hans Christian Andersen said it all. The emperor has no clothes. So too will we see that little boys often see better than their elders. New technology will change our lives, but will not change the basic laws of economics. The beginning of the future is tomorrow, not 10 years from tomorrow. These are exciting times. Explosions of creativity are changing the way we live and creating great optimism. I share that optimism.
The problem is all inside your head, she said to me. The answer's easy if you think less logically. I'd like to help you all get rich at 23. There must be 50 ways to make $1 billion. She said you really needn't bother with cash flow. Valuation is the buzzword, only multiples must grow. And I'll repeat myself at the risk of sounding slow. There must be 50 ways to make $1 billion. 50 ways to make $1 billion. Just add a .com, Tom. Punch your name with an E, Lee. Start auctioning toys, Roy, and set yourself free. Pay on the come, son. Don't need to make money. Just set up a site, Mike, and price yourself right. She said it grieves me to see you left out in the cold. Here's just one tip. Don't sweat what's bought or sold. I said, I appreciate that. Would you please explain about the 50 ways? Just sell it to Gates, mates. Show PC's a plant stand. Float an IPO flow and let yourself go. Take eyeballs to the street, Pete. Go and launch an emo, Paul. Just get with the trend, friend, and let yourself spend. But she never said what happens in cold economic light. Are the emperor's clothes on? Will discount cash flows dictate flight? Because it hit me. Can all this cyber math be right? Are there 50 ways to make $1 billion? 50 ways to make $1 billion. Just add a .com, Tom. Front your name with an E, Lee. Start auctioning toys, Roy, and set yourself free. Pay on the come, son. Don't need to make money. Just set up a site, Mike, and price yourself right.
Well, this was in 1999. I don't think there was anyone talking like that then. How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, the answer is that what I have been able to do better than most people is look at things and eliminate the noise. You know, there are no members of the Ford 400 that are lemmings. The people who have excelled economically to that level, other than those that inherited it, have all been people who turned right when everybody else turned left. I don't believe in conventional wisdom, and therefore, I challenge conventional wisdom. At the time, everybody's talking about the new paradigm, the new paradigm, and how everything was going to be different, and I just looked at it and said, I don't understand. I didn't understand how you spend your way to profitability. I didn't understand, what people were doing. I looked at the internet, and the internet had no barriers to access. It's very difficult to make a lot of money when there's no barriers. When there's no barriers to access. So for me, it was very logical. The fact that nobody agreed with me has never bothered me in the past, and is unlikely to bother me in the future.
Well, before we are totally adulating of you, you also had etched in there eBay, Amazon, and Microsoft as if they were going to go down the toilet immediately.
Well, actually, what I had in there was the tape around the gentleman, and it was all .com related companies.
Did you expect them to become the behemoths that they are today?
Yeah. I mean,
Surprised that they're still
I'm
around.
not surprised, but I'm also looking at the fact that, out of what, every 25 internet companies created, maybe one survived, and out of every 100 created, one got to scale, and out of every 1,000 created, one was actually a success. That's a really bad batting average.
Now, I'm going to have a quiz here on each of these. And by the way, this one didn't show it, but they all, in the end, move and do kinds of gyrations. There's a lot of motion in them. Very sophisticated. These are going to be definitely collector's items, and already are. And all of them have an etching on them which says Saltator Sepulchri in Latin. Who's our Latin expert here? Anyone know what that is? Saltator, I'm sure my pronunciation isn't good. I always flunk that. Sepulchri, Saltator Sepulchri.
I guess we don't have any Latin
No,
scholars
nobody
here.
went to Catholic school here. So, something the brave.
Right.
The
You're
grave.
right.
Okay, good. So what do you think it is, knowing Sam? It is grave dancer or dancer on the grave. So why grave dancer?
During the early 70s, we had a pretty severe real estate, both boom and recession, one following the other. And I was very active in the early 70s. And then one day I just looked around and I said, this doesn't make sense. And everybody is doing crazy things and lending too much money, et cetera, et cetera. And so I stopped doing what I was doing and basically spent 6 months building a distressed property management company. And then from the middle of 73 till the end of 76, we bought more real estate than anybody in the United States. And we bought it for $1 down and a hope certificate. And then subsequently I was asked about it, and New York University asked me to write an article on my experience. And so I started writing the article, and I started thinking about, well, how do I depict what I'm doing? And basically I decided to title the article The Grave Dancer. And the last line of the article was that, you gotta dance around the edge, but you gotta be careful you don't fall in.
Right. So speaking of not falling in, what do you think about the current economy? Are we in a recession?
I don't think we're in a recession. I don't think we're going into a recession. I think we have a particularly difficult credit situation right now. And and from my perspective, the closer you are to the credit markets, the more pessimistic you are, unless you're one of the two Democratic candidates. And you can be pessimistic because you're basically selling something that if they keep it up, might even be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I don't think any of them understand. I don't think we're having a recession. Are we slowing down? Sure. But nobody seems to remember that the third quarter of 2007, we grew at 4.9%, which is a huge number. In the fourth quarter, we're going to probably end up growing at 1 or 1.5%. So there's been a deceleration. But the definition of a recession is 2 quarters of negative growth. And at least at the moment, I just don't see that. And for every horror story you can describe on Wall Street or subprime or something like that, you can go to the Farm Belt, and the farmers have never made more and more money in their life. You can go to, Texas and the energy areas, and there's full employment. And there was an article, and I think it was the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times this morning about, kids getting degrees in geology and petroleum engineering. I literally are standing there fending off offers. So, you would think if you listen to the language going on, I think you would think that there's some giant rainstorm circling around the United States, and it's just awful and it's terrible. And I guess my answer is I don't see it. Are we slowing down? Yes.
Are you investing in real estate in the United States?
We're investing very little in real
Because?
estate because we have a much higher risk appetite. In other words, I don't think that there's great opportunity to take great risk and get great reward at the moment in the U.S. real estate market. On the other hand, all of these savants who, in the last 2 weeks have started to say, well, commercial real estate is going to follow subprime, they have no idea what they're talking about. Not even close.
So you heard it here, and as I said to Sam earlier, from his mouth to God's ears. Now I'm going to shift a little bit now towards local issues and things that are more immediate around newspapers. Now you're known as a Chicagoan. I mean, people think of you as that, even though you're on a plane more than half of your life almost. Many people probably don't know that you actually have a house that you spend most weekends at in Malibu. But do you have any emotional attachment to Los Angeles?
I think that I was born in Chicago. I certainly could have lived anywhere over the last 40 years and chose to live in Chicago. So I for sure feel that that's my home, and I'm sure I'll always think it's my home. I have a house in New York, I have a house in Sun Valley, I have a house in Malibu, and I love all of them, and I love being and spending time at all of them. So by definition, I also have emotional connections. But first and foremost, I am where my origins are from.
So I'm going to turn to the newspaper industry a little bit, and just a few stats on the newspaper industry, and I'm sure you'll have some more optimistic ones. But if I look at the performance of newspapers over the years, there are today in the U.S. 250 fewer major newspapers than there were in the 60s, despite huge population growth. The valuations of top newspapers were down almost 50%, like Dow Jones or Times Mirror, before being bid up, just before they were purchased. In the early 90s, the LA Times had a circulation of maybe 1.1 million. Today, it's about 800,000, if I'm not mistaken. And though the counter-argument is that its website has had annualized growth of 20% each year, and as many of you know, at least in this paper, they've gone through 4 editors in the last 3 years over issues related to budgets and and financial matters at newspapers. So what the heck were you thinking of when you bought the Tribune?
Everything is a function of price. So, in effect, from my perspective, I looked at the Tribune. I looked at what I perceived the opportunity to be. I looked at the price of entry, and I structured the transaction in a way that gave us a materially better opportunity of succeeding. And and when I did my projections over the next 10 years, the assumption was that revenue and EBITDA from newspapers would continue to erode every year, that broadcasting would be better, and that interactive would grow significantly. The only thing wrong so far is that in the first 60 days, newspaper revenue has dropped more than we would have expected. To some extent, that may be all this recession mongering. To some extent, it may be, the fact that we are slowing. Obviously, at the rate of that newspapers have declined in the last 60 days, there's not much hope for the newspaper business. But I doubt very much that the last 60 days are indicative. Is it a growing media? No. Does it have lots of opportunities that I think to both make money and make a difference? Yes.
Okay, so where are those opportunities? You mentioned the internet.
Well, but let's limit it for the moment to newspapers. In Chicago, the Tribune created a product called Red Eye. Red Eye is basically a free commuter newspaper geared toward 25 to 40-year-olds. The result has been it's very successful. It's making money. It's free. And it's a newspaper. So that only proves that you can do that. In Fort Lauderdale, we're producing a weekly free teen newspaper where half the content is being written by the students. And it's totally financed by advertisers that specifically want to reach this demographic group. The result is we're making money. It's newspapers. It's new. It's different, and it's making progress. So what I would say to you is I think there's lots of ways that we can improve, but you got to start by taking into consideration the history. This was a monopoly business. This was a business that, they could say anything, do anything, write anything. It didn't matter. They had a monopoly, and a monopoly with big margins. And like all monopolistic businesses, whether it was AT&T or the utility or the newspaper, monopolies get soft. Monopolies lose their ability to compete. Monopolies become arrogant, take on hubristic characteristics. The newspaper industry is no different than the others.
So I'm going to be real simple-minded about this. So I think about the dollars that are lost in advertising revenue in the print media, and do they just shift to the online media, dollar for dollar?
I don't think that's the case either. I do not think newspapers have disappeared. I don't think that 20 years from now, we'll all look at each other and say, now what was a newspaper? I just don't think that's the case. I think the newspapers have to take advantage of the technology to target their audience better and better and better. They have to give up a lot of their historical perspectives. And frankly, they have to understand who their customer is. And in the newspaper business, you have two customers. You have a reader and an advertiser. And they basically determine your success or failure. And in effect, in most businesses, the customer is always right. The newspaper business, the customer is often not consulted.
So with that in mind, you talk about the individual and you talk about the advertiser. Is there an additional customer, and that's the city? Is there a role that a paper should play in a city?
I think that every media outlet, paper, TV, radio, internet, has a responsibility to the overall community. I'm not sure I would define that responsibility as a city per se, but I certainly think that every media outlet has a responsibility to its general public. But I think that responsibility is met by producing clear, concise, honest news, limiting opinions to the editorial page. And basically, I think that's the ultimate service, and being a repository of information. And in the case of newspapers, one that publishes once a day for the record.
And tell us how you read newspapers or how you get information. Skip the word read newspapers. How do you get information about what's going on in the world?
Well, I start every day by reading the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times. So I read those 4 newspapers every single day. I also have a Bloomberg on my desk, so I'm constantly updating my information every day, real time. I read, I don't know, 6 magazines a week. And I just absorb all that. And somehow, whether it's like, putting ingredients into a mix master, and then it mixes everything up, and then somehow or other it gets clarified in my head.
Well, I can tell you because I'm around students quite a bit. This is not a generation that reads 4 papers.
I'm sorry?
This is not a generation that reads 4 papers when they get up.
I understand.
So are you concerned that the changing patterns of gathering information are going to lead to a less informed public? Or do you think it's just going to get substituted with other forms of information?
Well, first of all, for sure it'll get substituted. But second of all, in Chicago, I mentioned the red eye. If you go on one of the commuter trains, you will see everybody reading it. So
Because they're bored or because they're interested?
I would assume that they might have started out being bored, but if we don't produce an interesting product, it's very easy to put it down. So it's our job to entice them. It's our job to create environments that are newspaper friendly. Part of the reason we're doing the high school thing is because, in effect, we are trying to change behavioral patterns. But I would also remind you that I never read the newspaper every day when I was growing up. I never read the newspaper every day when I was in my 20s.
And what do you see as the synergies between the various broadcast and print properties that you have, like you have in LA, you have a newspaper and TV?
And I guess the answer is that I don't think that there has been much effort at cross-fertilizing the different media outlets. As a matter of fact, the other night, 2 LA Times reporters did part of the 10 o'clock news on KTLA. And I believe that was the first time ever that a LA Times reporter had appeared as a, for lack of a better word, talking head on KTLA. If you think about how those 2 media outlets could cooperate, could interface, could share an assignment desk, could be much more one unit than they are, I think that's part of the opportunity that I have.
What do you think of Google? Is it a partner or a competitor?
When I think about Google, it kind of reminds me of the dentist story, where you go to the dentist and he takes, the drill out, and he's holding the drill over your mouth, and you very quietly grab his testicles, and then you look at him and you say, "We're not going to hurt each other, are we?" I think that's how I feel about Google.
Well, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to
Which
think
part
of the
didn't you
best-
understand? I could talk slower.
But is Google on a level playing field with you?
Oh, I
didn't want to go
yeah,
to the metaphor.
Yeah, I understand. I guess the answer is that obviously Google is the #1 search company in the world. They search information. We produce information. Eventually, we're going to have to come to grips with what our relationship should be.
And can they be a substitute for you? I mean, that's a danger.
I am less concerned about that because I think in the end, and newspapers are really and should be local. And as such, an entity like Google can't really produce that kind of local content that we can.
So I think by now we've all agreed that you're not an unopinionated kind of guy.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah. So you did mention the LA Times, by the way, among the 4 papers that you read every day. But let's add that as the 5th. So you're gonna.
Now, when I'm in Los Angeles,
I hope so.
I
Yeah.
read the LA Times, of course.
So you pick up the paper, and they come out in the editorial, or let's even stretch it on the front page with something that seeps into opinion. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to just swallow hard?
I think the only thing that I would do is attempt to convince my publishers that veracity and credibility are really the strengths of who and what we are. And if we lose that, then we can, in fact, become irrelevant. So since I think relevance is important, I think it's really critical that we limit our editorial commentary to the editorial page.
And the LA Times comes out and endorses, let's pick randomly, Hillary Clinton for president. And let's just assume that you might not be in favor of Hillary Clinton. Well,
I think that'd probably be a good justification to sell the paper.
Short of that, would you do anything about it?
No. I mean, when I first signed up this deal, I did an interview with the Chicago Tribune. And the guy interviewing me looked at me and he said, "What are you going to do when we write a bad article about you?" I said, "You already have." And what did I do? Nothing. And the answer is that, unfortunately, that may, in fact, reflect the fact that the newspaper's power in our community is no longer what it once was.
You mentioned selling the paper. Is an asset to be sold, whether it's the Cubs or the LA Times or the Chicago Tribune, depending on price?
I think that I am a CEO here. I'm a chairman here. I have an economic interest here. But I also have the economic interest of the other owners, which probably amount to another 15,000 people. And as the person in charge, it's my responsibility to look at the pluses, the minuses, the risks, the rewards, and make those kinds of decisions.
But those owners also happen to be employees.
That's true. But my responsibility is to intelligently run the business. And if I think that the prospects for the business are significantly negative, or I think that somebody is willing to pay a price for a particular asset that I think is outlandish, I have to recognize that as the reality and deal with it accordingly.
I think that probably everyone knows that this is the particular structure of this S corporation is that it's an employee stock ownership plan owned by the employees. So when you're selling for a high price, you're also selling the people who
Sure.
own the paper. And then maybe one last question before we open it up. There are other properties here. The Tribune Entertainment Studio. Everything is on the block for the right bidder.
That's a little too aggressive. I think that first and foremost, we are assessing all of our assets and attempting to determine what we need to own long term and what we don't. And where we perceive something as either superfluous, obsolete, or in one way or another doesn't fit, we're going to sell it. And we're going to aggressively sell it. So we sold the studios here in LA because the economic value of those studios was, or the land was so much greater than any role that the studios played. And the studios were in no way, shape, or form critical to our business. They were just an asset that nobody dealt with. We dealt with it. And I think we will address all of the rest of the assets in a similar fashion.
And you're telling me that as a Chicago guy, you don't have a little bit more attachment to the Cubs or Wrigley Stadium than just any other asset?
I think I made it very clear from day one that I intended to sell the Cubs, and nothing has changed.
So, you may have some questions for Sam.
We do have microphones on both sides of the theater. If you raise your hands and you're called on, we'll bring you a mic that you can speak right into.
So the mics are over there. And please, if you don't mind, keeping the questions brief.
There's a guy down here.
Go ahead.
I'm surprised to be the first, but congratulations, and I wish you luck on your entrepreneurial venture here. For us, the readers, as well as you, the entrepreneur. Quickly, one of my favorite cartoons shows a man at a breakfast table, and his wife bringing him the paper, and he simply says, "Why don't you just beat me over the head with it until I get senseless?" Sam, sometimes it's pretty hard to read the paper, the negativity and the things that are shown in the paper. I'm simply asking, would you have some desire to make the paper more positive? Make all these papers more positive?
Well, you're not the first person to raise that question. As you can tell by having listened to me for the last hour, it would be inappropriate to describe me as a pessimist. Therefore, I would suggest to you that generally speaking, I think that the newspapers have generally, not just the LA Times, but most of them have dwelled on the negative, on some theory that dwelling on the negative is what people want to read. I'm not sure that's the case, but I think that when you look at journalistic endeavors generally, it seems as though an awful lot of stuff is being written that nobody wants to read. And that's certainly one of my challenges.
Side of the room. Right up here. Yep, thanks.
I have to respond because I guess there are lots of different readers of the Los Angeles Times who have widely divergent opinions on this subject, but I am so worried about what's happening to the hardcore news reporting at the LA Times, the national news, the international news. I've been a longtime subscriber, daily subscriber, and there are a lot of very difficult, challenging problems that we face in the world and we face in our community, and I don't read the newspaper to feel good. I read the newspaper to really learn about what is going on in our world as well as in our local community. And it's very distressing the last many years, all the changes and cuts in the newsroom. And I'd like to know a little bit more about your plans for the future with the really the stuff that's in the main section of the paper, not all the entertainment and other stuff.
Well, I guess I would answer you as follows. Number one, I can't speak to anything prior to 60 days ago, other than I can tell you that the cuts in the newsroom have been smaller than the declines in the revenue. And so when it's all said and done, we have customers out there. If we can't get enough people to buy the newspaper, then it really doesn't matter. And it's the last time I checked, newspaper is not an eleemosynary institution, and it must earn its way. And reporters must report in a manner that attracts readers. And I don't know how to put it any more simply than that. You can have all of the best of everything, and eventually you lose enough money that you go out of business. We have that situation in many newspapers across the country today. And the newspapers have to rethink, what their role is, because in the end, they got to pay for the newsprint. They got to pay for the delivery. They got to pay the editorial department's salaries. If they don't have the revenue, it ain't going to happen. So you can have all of those concerns that you have, and I certainly understand your concerns. But in the end, it's got to be economic, or it isn't going to happen.
Dick, you wanted to ask a question, but you need a microphone.
Sam.
Good morning, Richard, or good evening, Richard.
Good evening, Sam. There's chaos in the financial markets today, the credit markets, the CMBS, CDO markets. We hear rumors they're going to reduce interest rates. We hear rumors there's big-time inflation in food costs, everything else. What is, do you think, the interim, the short-term answer that'll calm all this down so it doesn't turn into abject chaos?
Well, Judy was going to end this session as you left by playing my 2007 commentary to my friends. And I think maybe, Judy, this would be the perfect time to do that as an answer to Richard's question.
Okay.
Can we get that, the next one played? So this was sent out in December of last year, the end of last year. So why were you surprised? When risk disappears from underwriting standards, can potholes be far behind? When greed defeats fear, the pigs get slaughtered. The scale is manageable, the repricing of risk, the reestablishment of standards and covenants, the reemergence of equity will slowly unclog a system looking for a market. Patience, a strong economy that can absorb the correction, will carry us through the year. Once again, this is Sam Zell, wishing you a healthy, happy, and prosperous new year.
Tune up the Dow in the Capitol line till we hit a big old pothole that started with subprime. Hey, that's my banker with the red stop sign. Confusion, credit confusion. The debt markets are a mess of confusion. Are they never gonna lend again? Make the loan to me, Joan. Bench is hacking on the fast track with a foot made of lead. But the credit squeeze has got me and the deals are going dead. On bridges, with retaining up ahead. Confusion, credit confusion. Can't bring M&A to a satisfying conclusion. Am I never gonna borrow again? Where's my deal, Neil? I took a little flyer and was feeling all right, but financing's up 100 points and I've got it fried. The raglines are humongous, my balance sheet's a sight. Confusion, credit confusion. My hedge funds were pricing and I can't take dilution. I'm never gonna invest again. Slip the Valium to me, Alan. What happened to the CDOs we labeled AAA? Now we just can't get a mark, can't get paper away. The lines of Northern Rock really ruined my day. Confusion, credit confusion. Due diligence is my new resolution. I never rated it again. Unfreeze my money, honey. We'll leverage residential the American way. Countrywide transmission loans, prices rose by the day. Like musical chairs, easy loans kept it in play. Confusion, credit confusion, and then the subside market just a crazy illusion. I'm never gonna buy again. Can I sell you a condo, Tonto? The trading desk is quieter than there's no see on time. I'm as lonely as the Maytag guy and can't make a dime. Empty cubicles around me like the scene of a crime. Confusion, credit confusion. From Merrill Lynch to the Dole Q, I'm taking a bruising. Am I never gonna trade again? Give me a bit, sit, please. But the moral of the story is it ain't no disaster. Risk premiums are repricing, that's the concept of master. Though it's slower, it ain't over, no way. There's still liquidity, more equity. Drive safely.
Richard, in answer to your question, I think it starts with the understanding that a great deal of where we are today is the result of marks as opposed to losses, meaning that Merrill Lynch takes a $10 billion write-off. What that means is Merrill Lynch's balance sheet is no different from one day to the next, except that the quote, marked valuation has changed. And that, of course, I mean, you know, we own a CDO that was marked at 0 9 months ago. We've received payments every month on a 0 marked asset for the last 9 months. And I think we're going to get all of our money back. I think that the current market is just in a state of confusion and constipation. As I said in that video, I think it's just going to take time and a return of confidence. I believe that you're going to see housing start to move in the spring. I think that if housing does in fact start to stabilize, that alone changes the whole perspective on residential paper. Because right now everybody is scared of buying residential paper because it may be worth less tomorrow. I think there's a lot of places in our market, in our world where this is true. But when it's all said and done, Dick, you and I, better than most, know that money has been free for the last 7 or 8 years. Free. And both of us have helped ourselves to it very significantly.
Next question here in the middle. And again, if we can shorten the questions and maybe even the
Go ahead.
answers, Sam, we
Thank
can
you.
get through a lot.
Two questions. One's very short. The first is you mentioned the newspapers that you read every morning, but you haven't mentioned any websites. So I'm curious which websites you like to peruse every day. The second question.
None.
Appropriate answer.
I mean, other than the Bloomberg News
Bloomberg, yeah.
that's on my desk and I'm looking at it every day.
Gotcha. The second is if you were in your 20s now, where would you be and what would you be doing?
I don't know. Obviously, I think I'm an entrepreneur, and obviously that's been my experience. I don't know what I would be doing, but I think that I would be in no different a state today than when I was in my 20s. Almost every question, every time I speak, somebody asks the question about, well, I know how easy it was for you, Sam, but what is going to happen to me? And every generation since the beginning of time has asked that same question. And every generation has assumed that the good fortune of the last generation would be, unfortunately, not available to the next generation. And every generation, and that's what's so special about America, and that's what makes it work.
I'm going to alternate sides. So, well, I think down here on this side, thank you.
I'm a filmmaker who actually came to learn of you from reading The New Yorker and the article about you a few months ago. And because it's clear that you like to express yourself artistically, and because I'm a filmmaker who's intentionally moving to Chicago for the art scene there, I'm curious to hear about a film that matters to you. And could you please explain why that film matters or excites you?
I don't go to the movies.
Not even the movies shown at the art museums in Chicago that you and your wife
I
support?
don't go to the movies at all. I read a couple of escapist books a week. And that's my, pursuit of delusion. On the other hand, my wife goes to the movies all the time. Last night you did, right? I was out of town and she went to the movies last night. But the answer is, I'd like to think of myself as creative. My own experience is that I have a lot of trouble with the realistic or the lack of realism in the movie business. And therefore I spend most of my time reading.
Down here. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. Sam, you were talking about the value of your assets, Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, and the fact that declining advertising revenues have impacted what you expected. My question is, what is your curiosity and interest in new media as potentially a major accelerator on valuation of your companies? And by new media, I do not mean PCs. To me, it is old media. I mean cell phones as a new news platform and contrary media platform to do that.
Well, the answer is that the various Tribune companies, despite the fact that they're letting people go in the newspaper side, are hiring people at a prodigious rate on the interactive side. And I think that process will continue. I know that the interactive people are working on all kinds of distribution vehicles, and obviously the cell phone is going to become a distribution vehicle, and they're using and trying to put together the right kind of information from the content that would be applicable there. But that's very much in the future.
On this side, please. Thank you.
Your real estate activity is primarily in the developing world now. I'd just love to hear some comments on another market we read a lot about, and that's Dubai, Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. Has the paradigm changed there? Can people really expect a return on the investments?
Well, I'm quite familiar with those areas. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. I guess what I would say to you is that the last time there was an oil boom, which was in the late 70s, they basically took in the money and either spent it frivolously or lent it to Citibank, who then lent it to sovereign nations who didn't pay them back. This time around, they are dramatically investing in their own countries and in their own regions. The result is that, what's going on in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Rabat, all over Morocco, Egypt. There's just enormous, Kuwait, Jordan. There's just a lot going on in the Middle East. Whether or not you get an adequate return or not, I think it has a lot to do with where you play and how you play. In an environment that exists, like say in Dubai today, I think I'd rather be a manufacturer of product selling it than an owner of product in a market where there's constant, additional supply. Obviously, every one of these markets has different characteristics. We're pretty involved in a whole bunch of them. Longer term, I think they're going to be great markets. I think you're going to have the kind of volatility. I mean, there are no more volatile stock markets in the world than the Middle Eastern ones at the moment. And that's a function of the fact that there's so much money, there's relatively little sophistication. But I think that's all evolving and evolving in a positive fashion.
And the back there? Thank you.
We have time for just about 2 more questions here.
And I'm going to reserve the right for a couple more.
We need somebody to come down here. These people have been
Yes, I'm sorry.
raising their hands for a long time. Go ahead.
Are your children involved in your businesses, and are you concerned about the estate tax?
Number one, only one of I have 3 children, only one of which is involved in the business. I never, ever thought that my business needed to be passed on to someone who had the same blood type as I have. I've always felt that the most important thing I have to do is provide for the intelligent continuation of my businesses without regard to the last name of whoever is doing it. And so I've set up my operations in a very professional fashion so that it can continue and continue to manage family assets without, quote, either dying or being passed on to someone who doesn't have the capability. So I've always believed in meritocracy and have tried to implement it. As far as estate taxes are concerned, it's not hard for me to be very supportive of those who would like to eliminate estate taxes. I think that they are, basically what you're doing is you're taxing somebody for a second time on income that has already been taxed once. That doesn't make a lot of sense. That's a redistribution of wealth game. And that's not what the tax code should be doing.
Let's go down here. Thank you.
I would like it if you could comment on China. We hear and we see the tremendous advances that China has made, how industrious their people are. And we also hear that China is going to overtake the United States as the greatest nation in the world. Could you please comment on that as you see things?
Well, first of all, allow me to remind you that in the 80s, it wasn't China, but it was Japan that was going to take over the United States as the most important country in the world. The answer is China is a very dynamic area. It's become the manufacturing base of the world. But I'd also tell you that there is a demographic time bomb, and it's no more than about 12 years away. Because China's a one-child policy, there's still plenty of people in the boondocks who are coming in and providing, workers. But that's becoming more and more difficult, and the one China policy has basically created lots of other problems. History says that it ain't really terrific to have a country with too many males and not enough females. And I think that's coming down the pike here, and I think it's very difficult. It's a very dynamic area. It's an area where things get done, as opposed to India, where the bureaucracy is just about impossible. But on the other hand, don't ever kid yourself. There is no rule of law. God help you if you have to sue anybody or resolve something in a legal system that doesn't exist. But that's pretty much true of most of the emerging markets, not just China.
All right. one more question there, and then I'll close it. Thank you.
Mr. Zell, you said, talking about, I think, the editorial page, you talked about veracity and honesty, but that's all in the eye of the beholder.
I don't think that's true at all.
Okay, let me go on. I guess in looking through the websites about yourself, where you don't have much of a history in media, you do have a long history in lobbying and financially and politically lobbying on behalf of the United States, continuing their support of Israel. And I wonder if that will come into play on the editorial pages. Can we have any assurance from you that there won't be from you any pressure on the editorial page?
I don't think that that's an appropriate question to ask me. I have stated over and over again that my attitude is that I do not intend to influence the editorial page of this new newspaper or any other. Second of all, I want to clear up for you the fact that as best as I know, I have never lobbied for any country, period, in speech. So I don't know where you come up with all of this lobbying that you're referring to, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. But I don't think you know what you're talking about.
I want to pick up on the question related to the estate taxes, if you will. And you're a person that's achieved a lot, and there are examples of the Zell philanthropy all over the place, at Wharton, at Michigan, at the Hebrew University, which makes me very happy because I believe in supporting education. Will we ever see a Zell Foundation or a Zell mega hospital or along the lines of a Gates or a Kellogg or a Knight Foundation?
First of all, I don't know. Second of all, there already is a Zell Family Foundation. But I doubt, in other words, I was brought up with a very heavy emphasis on the importance of charity. Nothing has ever changed. As a matter of fact, when I go around and talk to the Tribune employees, I tell them that if this deal really works, all that means is I got to give away more money. Being able to give away money is just an unbelievably terrific thing. I mean, it's the ultimate. I mean, you can. This is how you can make a difference.
We can help there, UCLA Anderson.
Right, I'm sure. I want you to know I've had opportunity already at UCLA Anderson.
Right. Okay, this will be the last question. Have you decided who you're going to vote for?
I actually get this question quite often.
There are a couple of Chicago folks in the running here.
And my answer is ABC.
Okay.
Anybody but Clinton.
Okay. And with that, I want to thank Annie and the Hammer Museum for having us. And thank each of you for coming. Thank you very much.